In the 1st century, the Roman Empire cast a long shadow across the known world. Its frontiers were the edges of civilization, and beyond them lay only mist and myth. One such frontier was Britannia, an island of dense forests, unpredictable tribes, and a stubborn resistance to the order of Rome. The conquest, begun under Emperor Claudius, was a slow, grinding affair. Legions had established forts, built roads, and imposed a veneer of Roman law. But this was a fragile peace, a thin layer of imperial authority stretched over a deep well of resentment. It was a province held by the sword, and the people it governed had not forgotten the world they had lost. At the heart of this simmering tension were the client kingdoms, a political tool Rome used to manage its borders. These were native tribes allowed to retain their rulers and a measure of self-governance in exchange for loyalty and tribute. The Iceni, a tribe in the lands of what is now Norfolk, were one such kingdom. They were led by a king named Prasutagus, a man who understood the precarious balance of his position. He had lived a life of wealth and privilege, but he knew it was a life lived entirely at the pleasure of his Roman overlords. His power was a loan, not a right. To secure the future of his people and his own lineage, Prasutagus devised a plan he believed was a masterstroke of diplomacy. In his final will, he named the Roman Emperor Nero as co-heir to his kingdom, alongside his own 2 daughters. This was a calculated appeal to Roman law and custom. By making the emperor a beneficiary, he sought to place his family under imperial protection, ensuring a smooth transition and preserving the Iceni's semi-independent status. It was a logical, strategic move designed to appease a distant, powerful ruler. But it fundamentally misjudged the men on the ground. Upon the king's death, the local Roman authorities saw not an opportunity for partnership, but for plunder. The will was declared void. The procurator, Decianus Catus, moved to annex the Iceni lands completely. Prasutagus's kingdom was systematically stripped of its wealth. His nobles were treated as conquered slaves, and their ancestral lands were seized. When his queen, Boudica, protested this flagrant violation of her husband's testament, she was publicly flogged. Her daughters were subjected to the ultimate humiliation. This was not mere greed. It was a calculated act of terror, a message sent in welts and wounds, designed to break the spirit of a people and extinguish any notion of their sovereignty. The motivations behind this brutality were twofold. First was the institutional arrogance of an empire that saw provincial subjects as little more than resources to be exploited. To the local administrators, the Iceni were simply barbarians, and their claims to property and dignity were meaningless. Second was the crippling debt that Prasutagus's court had been encouraged to take on from Roman financiers, including the philosopher Seneca. The king's death was the moment to call in these debts with crushing force, seizing the entirety of the kingdom as collateral. The violence against Boudica and her daughters was a public demonstration that Roman power was absolute and that native honor held no currency. This profound personal violation transformed a political crisis into a blood feud. For Boudica, the issue was no longer one of legal inheritance or tribal autonomy. It had become a matter of vengeance. The lash marks on her back and the trauma inflicted upon her children ignited a firestorm of righteous fury. She emerged not as a grieving widow, but as a warrior queen, a living symbol of Roman cruelty and Celtic defiance. Her personal grievance became the rallying cry for a generation of subjugated tribes, channeling their simmering hatred into a singular, focused desire for retribution. The timing for such an uprising was perfect. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, a methodical and ruthless commander, was hundreds of miles away on the far side of the province. He had taken 2 of his 4 legions, the 14th and 20th, to the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, the last stronghold of the Druids. With the bulk of Rome's military might occupied in the west, the east of Britannia was left dangerously exposed. This strategic vulnerability offered a window of opportunity that Boudica and her allies would not ignore. Their first target was the Roman colony of Camulodunum, today's Colchester. This city was a monument to Roman dominance. It was a settlement for legionary veterans built directly upon a former tribal capital. At its center stood a massive temple dedicated to the deified Emperor Claudius, a constant stone and marble reminder of the conquest. For the Britons, Camulodunum was the heart of their oppression. Boudica's war host, a coalition of the Iceni, the Trinovantes and others, descended upon the city with terrifying speed. The attack was not a battle, it was an annihilation. The fall of Camulodunum was so swift because it was a symbol, not a fortress. As a colonia, it was designed for retired soldiers to live in civilian comfort, not to withstand a major siege. It had no significant defensive walls. The veterans, overconfident and contemptuous of the locals, were caught completely unprepared. They made a last stand in the stone temple of Claudius, holding out for 2 days before the structure was stormed, and every last defender was put to the sword. The city was then razed to the ground, its destruction a clear message. Roman civilization itself was the enemy. The nearest Roman military force, a detachment of the 9th Legion under Quintus Petilius Cerialis, marched to intercept the rebels. They walked directly into an ambush. The disciplined, heavily armored legionaries were overwhelmed by the sheer number and ferocity of the Britons fighting on their own terrain. The Roman infantry was wiped out. Cerialis and his cavalry barely managed to escape, fleeing back to the safety of their fort. This was a disaster of the highest order. An entire legion had been effectively destroyed in the field, proving that Boudica's rebellion was not a local riot, but a full-scale war that threatened to drive Rome from the island entirely. The news of this stunning victory spread like wildfire. The rebel army swelled in size as more and more tribes, sensing a shift in the balance of power, flocked to Boudica's banner. Their next target was Londinium, a burgeoning commercial center on the River Thames. It was not a military or political capital, but it was the economic heart of the province, a hub of merchants and trade, rich with the wealth of the empire. It was a symbol of the prosperity Rome had brought, and for that reason, it had to burn. Suetonius, a man of cold, pragmatic logic, had force-marched his legions back from the west in a desperate race against time. He arrived at Londinium before the rebel army, but a swift assessment of the situation revealed a grim reality. The city was unwalled and indefensible against the massive host bearing down on it. To attempt to hold it would mean the certain destruction of his elite veteran troops. He was faced with an agonizing choice: sacrifice the city to save his army, or sacrifice his army and the province to save the city. His decision was as brutal as it was necessary. He abandoned Londinium to its fate. What followed was a methodical slaughter. The inhabitants of Londinium who had not heeded Suetonius's order to evacuate were shown no mercy. The city was put to the torch. From there, the war host moved on to Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans, another pro-Roman town, and subjected it to the same fate. The Roman historian Tacitus estimates that 70,000 Roman citizens and their allies perished in the destruction of the 3 cities. This was a campaign of extermination, fueled by decades of resentment and unleashed with shocking brutality. Yet, within the rebellion's greatest strength lay its fatal weakness. Boudica's force was not a disciplined army. It was a tribal migration. It was a vast horde of warriors, but they were accompanied by their families, their wagons, and their possessions. They moved not with the swiftness of a military column, but with the ponderous pace of a people on the move. Their objective was vengeance, not the strategic consolidation of territory. They were a force of pure destruction, and they had allowed Suetonius, the master tactician, to escape and choose the time and place of the final confrontation. And choose he did. Suetonius found the perfect ground to make his stand, a location lost to history but described precisely by Tacitus. He positioned his force in a narrow gorge, with a dense forest protecting his rear and flanks. Before him lay a wide-open plain, upon which the British host would have to advance. This topography negated the Britons' overwhelming numerical advantage. They could not surround him. They would be forced into a frontal assault, funneling their vast numbers into the killing zone of his disciplined professional soldiers. The contrast between the two forces on that day was stark. Suetonius commanded fewer than 10,000 men, but they were the hardened veterans of the 14th and 20th legions, supported by auxiliaries. They were a professional killing machine, trained in formation fighting, armed with the deadly pilum and the short stabbing gladius. Facing them was Boudica's host, a force numbering perhaps over 100,000. They were confident, even arrogant after their recent victories, but they were a poorly organized mass of individual warriors, driven by passion rather than discipline. The battle began with a British charge. The vast tribal army surged across the plain, a wave of noise and fury. Boudica herself rode in a chariot among her warriors, urging them toward a final, decisive victory. The Roman line held firm, silent and unmoving. As the Britons entered effective range, the legionaries unleashed a devastating volley of their heavy javelins, the pila. The shower of steel tore into the charging ranks, staggering the assault and turning the British front into a chaotic mess of the dead and wounded. Then, Suetonius gave the order to advance. The Romans moved forward in their classic wedge formations, a disciplined wall of shields and steel. They crashed into the disorganized British lines, their short swords making brutal work of the enemy in the close quarters fighting. The battle became a slaughter. The Britons, unable to use their numbers effectively in the narrow space and technologically outmatched, began to break and flee. But their escape was cut off. In their overconfidence, they had drawn up their supply wagons in a crescent behind their lines, a gallery for their families to watch the expected victory. This crescent now became a barricade, trapping the routing warriors and turning the battlefield into a cauldron of death. The rebellion was broken in a single, bloody afternoon. Roman discipline had triumphed over Celtic fury. Boudica's fate remains a mystery. Roman sources claim she took poison to avoid capture, while Celtic legend suggests she died of her wounds or illness. In the aftermath, Rome's retribution was terrible. The province was subjected to a punitive campaign of fire and sword as Suetonius stamped out the last embers of resistance with merciless efficiency. Lands were laid waste and a famine ensued, completing the devastation the war had begun. Yet the rebellion of Boudica was a profound shock to the Roman system. It was the most serious threat the empire ever faced in its 400-year rule of Britain. It forced a change in administration, with a more conciliatory approach being adopted by future governors. The story of the warrior queen, born from an act of profound injustice, who brought the world's mightiest empire to the brink of expulsion from an entire province, endures. It stands as a timeless testament to how the strategic calculations of empires can be undone by the raw, indomitable power of human will when pushed beyond its limit.